Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Michael Rogg from Build for Humans in Texas.
Paulo.
I'm Paulo Ellias, currently at PBS Kids Digital.
And today we have on Evan Bacon, the Lord of Open Source. How you doing, Evan?
Indeed. Thank you for getting my title right. Thanks for having me.
Lord of Open Source.
Man, I'm real excited to have you on. I mean, I never thought I would have the actual Kevin Bacon on. This is just amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. Is that all you guys got?
Dang it, I really should have prepared more Kevin Bacon jokes.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sure it's something you've never heard before. But anyway, I apologize.
That's all the time I got.
I had to do it. So Evan, anyway, let's get down to it. So the reason we have you on is we want to talk to you about a little something called Expo. If you were out in San Fermin at the running of the bulls in Pamplona, and you're running, the bulls are chasing behind you, and some fellow person running next to you, he's got the red handkerchief on and everything. He says, "Hey, Evan, what is Expo anyway?" Like, what would you tell him?
Oh gosh. Yeah. Okay.
Don't think too long, because that bull's bearing down on you. It's 500 pounds of spite.
I can't really run per se, but I'll try to and picture it. So I guess.
All right.
Expo is I thought you were building into there was an app for this, because Expo would be a prime candidate for running with the bulls app that someone set up a day prior, and I wouldn't want to look at to iOS, Android, and web.
I don't know if I'd want to look at a phone while I'm running from these beasts, man. But so what is Expo though? I know what React Native is, at least to some extent. It's it allows you to use React to build native apps somehow. But where does Expo fit into the piece, the puzzle there? You know?
Yeah. So I like to think of React and React Native. I like to think of React Native kind of more like React DOM. Where it's closer to the runtime that you would use to write React for a native platform, whereas Expo is a universal React platform that you can use to just write React code once and run it everywhere. I think a lot of people have, if you've used React, heard of this concept of you can run React there or there, on your toaster, but it's not very clear how you use them together and how you stitch it all together, write it with one code base. So Expo lets you do all that. There's a bunch of build services, and there's a client, which works kind of like a browser, but for native apps. And it's something that you can use while you're developing to very quickly open your app without having to build the native part of your app onto your device. So there's a lot of really good tools for making React Native development even better than it already is.
So if we had to envision this kind of like a sandwich or layers of stuff, Expo is kind of a layer on top of React Native. Is that how it works? Or is it alongside, or where does it go?
Yeah, well, so I guess Expo is the group, right? And then there's the Expo client, which is similar to the browser. I think a lot of people, when they see the React Native docs and it says, so to get started, download Expo, they're somewhat confused by that, because it's kind of like in the React docs or something, where it'd be okay, so now you open this in Chrome. That first part is the client. And then we have a lot of SDKs, because what we found was that, packages. We found that it's just not very easy to build an app with everything that React Native was providing. So they didn't have things like the camera or the video or OpenGL. So we built a bunch of SDK components for that. And I would consider that a layer on top / this kind of interwoven thing that you need to use with React Native. And then we have a bunch of services. So you got this build service, which lets you build your app in the cloud using your developer credentials, which is really great, because if you don't have a MacBook, if you're maybe in a not American country, then it's a lot harder to get a MacBook. You're probably developing on a Windows computer, and you can build your iOS app in the cloud with that. Or if you just don't want to install your MacBook for 30 minutes while you wait for your app to build, you can use that as well. And I would consider that as kind of a different thing, but it's definitely very prevalent when you're making a React Native app.
So I'm trying to visualize what this thing is and draw analogies from things that I know. Is it kind of like a...
Yeah, I got Excalibur open right here. I'm just graphing it out.
Well, is it kind of like an IDE or a runtime, and then also has libraries to interface with the native bits as well? Or what? I'm a little fuzzy on where Expo fits into the whole ecosystem.
Yeah. So if you think about the developers of Expo, so it started by Charlie Cheever and James Ide, and they both worked at Facebook. And then the core contributor of React Native for the longest time, Brent Batney, also works on Expo. So it's a lot of people, I think, who you wanted to make React Native something that you could use for any kind of app. Whereas initially React Native was very focused on being something for Facebook and like that you could use to build Facebook. And so built out just a lot of scaffolding to make it into a system that you could use for any kind of app. And now with the addition of web, a website as well.
A constellation of things, like there's an Expo emulator and an Expo SDK and an Expo framework thing.
Yeah. And then in that context, React Native is more like React DOM, where it's like this thing that you install and you use it for like core parts and use it as the runtime, but you need all these other things to actually build something like this. Similar to like how you would use Next.js or Gatsby on the web.
So I can use React Native without Expo, but I can't use Expo without React Native. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that'd be fair to say.
But I probably wouldn't enjoy using React Native on its own, right? Because that's kind of, you've kind of built, well, you know.
Well, it depends on how much you want to, if you want to access the camera or file system or something like that. How much you want to build on your own versus using provided SDKs for that sort of stuff.
Right.
Yeah,
And if
so
you want to
Evan,
like install and fiddle with Xcode and Android Studio, which I don't know who
which
in
I've
their right
done.
mind would. Yeah. I'm sorry
I've
about
done
that.
both of those. No, it's fine. Go ahead, come on my podcast, insult me. I've done both of these things. And I don't blame you for having that opinion of things, because it is, you know, I mean, they're doing some interesting stuff with Swift UI and that type of thing. But yeah,
the
I mean,
whole stateful
Xcode
update system is very interesting.
Yeah, I know, right? Isn't it funny? Like you look at some of this stuff. I saw them demo it. I'm like, oh, sweet. They're building React. You know?
Yeah. How did they come up with that? That's crazy.
But it's really interesting. You know, me coming from an app background, and then I have been wanting to go full circle just to satisfy my morbidness, basically. Like I've wanted to build a native app using the newly acquired web skills that I have. So I've been talking to Paulo. Paulo has been my partner in crime. We've been kind of doing like skill swapping stuff. And so we were playing with Expo a couple of weeks ago, right, Paulo? And we decided that we were going to build an Uno app, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the basic idea is that I play Uno with my kids, and we wanted to build this app that would keep score, and you got to keep a running score from like game to game. And it's just, you know, it's like a stupid little project, but I thought it would be really fun to build it. And if I could build it where I could just click a button and it would be running on the web, it would be running on my iOS device, and it would be running on an Android device, like I thought that was pretty wild.
Yeah, it's pretty accurate.
From what I heard, Paulo got distracted though.
Yeah, so
slightly.
Paulo ruined everything. We would have been done with the app by now, but he had the nerve, the absolute nerve, to have a child. Like, how dare you, Paulo? Interrupt.
Damn it.
9 months ago, I should have been thinking about this.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, Paulo, no means
the
no.
JavaScript comes first.
Yeah.
It does.
Well, there's a promise joke in there somewhere. They can async. Oh, but I'm not.
Await async.
But I don't have it.
Yeah.
God.
Something about promise.race and
But anyway,
one of them resolved before the other.
But anyway, we were building this thing, right, Paulo? And you had used Expo before, but this was the first time that you had used it to build a web target, right? So tell us about your kind of reaction to that.
Yeah, so I was using Expo to build out a React Native app at IDEO before I left. And I don't know if I wasn't paying attention or the React Native web sort of portion of it is maybe
that's
a newer
new.
addition. Okay, cool. So we sort of noticed that there was this component of, you can build a target to the web. So I was like, we'll try it out. And so this little sort of boilerplate project, just a hello world type project, we built it and ran the build and loaded it up in a web browser. I was like, oh, that's pretty freaking cool. So you can build a React Native app with the React Native primitives, and they sort of translate over to the web fairly seamlessly. I don't know. Maybe we can get into it later to see how well they translate to more sort of complex projects and use cases. But it would save a ton of time. I could see when people need web and sort of native clients as well.
It's super awesome for if you're like working on the native app and you've kind of just scaffolded out the UI and you want to just send it to someone, because you don't need to go through like test flight. You don't need to figure out building it onto someone's device. You just have like a link and it's usable right away.
Yeah. And this was something that, so Paulo and I did a podcast on React Native a little while ago. And I mentioned this before, but when I knew nothing about React Native, I assumed that I could write my React code and it would run on Android and iOS and on the web. Like I thought that would just work. And Paulo was just like, nah, bro. Yeah, Paulo's like, nah, bro, that doesn't work. But it sounds like with Expo, that actually can happen now?
Yeah, so that's actually what I work on full time is the web platform for Expo.
Yep.
And I guess like a little background, React Native for Web was made by Nick Gallagher, who made like normalized CSS when he was at Twitter to build the Twitter Lite PWA, which is one of the best PWAs ever. And React Native Web is very refined. It can tree shake really well. It's got this super fast CSS and JS library, but it's pretty hard to use, I found. And so things that are missing is you need this complex Webpack config. And if you already have this Metro bundler config, which is going to get very technical, but if you've got one bundler for native and you've got a different bundler for web, and you kind of expect people to learn how to use Webpack and set up all this, it was just too difficult. So mostly people didn't use web. And so what I did was I added it to Expo CLI, and then you could just start up web using a very opinionated, good Webpack config, which is very similar to CRA's Webpack config.
So let's say I know React. Maybe I'm not, the world's best React programmer, but I've at least done some stuff in React.
Yeah, me either. Yeah.
How difficult is it to then start doing something in React Native? Is that a really difficult transition to do?
To be honest, it is harder than it should be. It's not difficult, I wouldn't say, but it should be much easier. So if you're like using an Expo app, for instance, right now, you could open it and start just writing React code. Like you could write div and p and all that, and it would only render to web, but you could still run it in the browser. And that is because the div and the p elements, like those don't render natively. So what you would do is you would just switch to using native primitives, which have like a binding, a class, which you could then render on iOS, Android, and web. And you could use things like view and image and text. And so if you come at it from that perspective, where web is a lot more prominent, which is what I've been trying to do with Expo, then it makes it a lot easier for you to transition into React Native from React.
Right. Because if we're used to writing components in React, or even just we're used to writing HTML, right? You could almost think of the paragraph tag as a component.
Right.
But I can't use paragraph on an iOS device because it doesn't know what the hell that is. So instead, React Native came up with its own neutral primitives or neutral things. So instead of paragraph, you have text. So then you would build a text component, and that on the web, I would imagine, ends up translating in, maybe it translates into a paragraph. I don't know. But on iOS, it would translate into a web view. A text view.
Yeah.
Not a web view.
To a web view with a P inside of it.
No. It would translate into a text view, which is an element that you can lay out in Interface Builder or whatever. And on Android, like, I don't know, I'm sure they've got some like analogous thing.
Yeah,
but the point is that
React.
Okay, so yeah, but the point is that there's this neutral standard in the middle that you build to that, and then Expo and React Native apparently take care of translating that on each device and on the web. That's kind of how it works, right?
Yeah. Well, so React Native Web it's like an out of tree solution for React Native. So it's not necessarily, you don't get it out of the box when you use React Native. React Native is for iOS and Android. So it's more of like an Expo thing, is when you're writing an Expo app, you're getting this ability to run on web, iOS, and Android. But yeah, so the primitive system is really nice, but after building out kind of and making it more user-friendly, I found that it was missing a lot of kind of interesting web features that don't exist on native, like native links, like the anchor element, where you can hover over it and you can, copy link, or like SEO. That's a big thing that really just doesn't exist on native, but it's a huge part of web development. And routing is another one, which kind of ties into the links. And so I created a system of primitives which kind of sway the other way, where they're more SEO and accessibility focused. And it's called HTML elements, where you would import a capital A element, and then you would use that capital A, and then that would render to an anchor element on web, and then just a text element on native that you could click and it would open a link, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Well, I can definitely help you with the SEO stuff if you ever need it.
Yeah.
This sounds really promising, because it sounds like the dream that I had originally, which was I can just write stuff in React and then I can build it on all these platforms. It sounds like Expo brings that closer to reality than anything else.
Yeah, definitely closer than anything before it. And just with time, we've seen the primitives get more and more advanced. I don't know if you saw this auth session thing that I just built, which is it's like a universal primitive API for doing auth like logging into something, and you just use one React hook. And then it works the same way across iOS, Android, and web, because web utilizes window.open to create a pop-up, which is similar to on iOS and Android when you like open that modal with the web view in it. And so we were able to combine a bunch of universal primitives like crypto and that web browser functionality, and then create this auth system, which you just write once, and now you have Dropbox authentication on iOS, Android, and web. And it's, again, just one hook, and it's 100% code shared across all of your platforms.
All right, so I got to ask the question, Evan. For my Uno app, why don't I just build this thing in Swift UI? Like, why would I use Expo to build this thing?
Well, because, maybe you want people with Android phones to use it. Maybe you want to use it on your phone in Safari. Maybe you don't want to get your kids' devices set up on Test Suite. Maybe you don't want to provision your kids' devices to run with your Apple ID and then build it individually onto all of their phones.
Oh, so you take care of a lot of the provisioning and all that kind of nonsense too?
Well, I just mean like if it's a website, you can just open it in Safari. And in our build service, you can provision devices automatically using your Apple credentials. So it all just happens automatically using Fastlane with a Node interface.
That's really cool. I mean, it's been a while since I have developed a native iOS app, but I remember that actually the build chain part of it, getting everything signed, getting everything built and submitted, and all, that was just a
really
giant,
demoralizing.
Yeah,
it was a giant pain in the ass.
It's nuts what you have to
Has
go
it gotten
through. That's
better?
one of the reasons I started using Expo is because I was like, I don't want to do this for this small little app just to get it to people to test out. So it was like, okay, I'm going this route now.
Yeah, and that's had a huge impact. I don't know if you guys have heard of this thing called the coronavirus. It's like this giant pandemic going on right now.
I've never heard of it. What is it? The beer?
It's probably the reason you're playing Uno every night. But it was really like a time-sensitive thing. And so we saw people just making tons of Expo apps to help people just collect data regarding if you've come into contact with people and stuff like that. And this one that really shined was called How We Feel. And I didn't even know it was made with Expo at first. I just downloaded it because I saw it on Reddit. And I think it's sponsored by Pinterest. I could be wrong about that, but they were able to it's a very simple app. They got it stood up and out into production, and it was immediately done. And I think that just wouldn't have happened if you were using other native platforms where you would have go through the slow iteration cycle, go through building and publishing, and you would also need to be pretty talented to get it out super fast. So Expo is that speed that's introduced has kind of opened up a new world of like app possibilities where you can be the first responder to make something really important.
I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I would like to get your take on it, Evan. So I'm going to mention it again. My wife works for a large grocery store company, and she works on one of the apps that they have. And it's an app for basically for creating or for picking up meals to go, right, from the grocery store. They are building this app natively. Right. So they've got an iOS team and they've got an Android team. And what is happening is that these teams are constantly...
Which one's your wife on?
Neither one, because she actually, her master's is computer graphic design. So she is kind of working with both teams, to do all that kind of stuff.
Nice.
But she'll come home and she'll tell me stories about how the Android team is behind the iOS team, or the iOS team is behind the Android team, or I can't implement this here, I can't implement that there. And I was just looking at what they were doing, the type of app that they were building, and it's relatively simple. It's not anything that requires any kind of native compilation speed or anything like that. And I'm like, you totally should do this in React Native. You should give that a go. You should try to do that.
Absolutely.
And,
I would actually go as far as to say Expo.
Right, well, this was before I even knew what Expo was, right? I was just like, no, React Native, like it's obvious that you should do that. And the reason you should do it is not, so this is a marketing driven app, really. So it's the marketing team that needs to be able to iterate quickly on this thing, and they can't have it be that one is out of sync with the other. So being able to have just one code base would be advantageous, but not just from super advantageous, right? But not just from a development point of view, but from a maintenance point of view. Like you're going to be married to this code base for a long time. It's not just, and so that, they were talking about, well, we tried this before and it didn't work out well. Who knows? Maybe they used like Cordova, or they used some kind of, who knows what they did.
So fast too. Like Expo's gotten exponentially better, full puns intended, over the last year. alone, and it's a completely different tool. So this stuff changes really fast.
Well, this must have been 3 or 4 years ago, right? So I don't even know what it was that they were using. But what I said to her was, just because you were burned by fire once doesn't mean you shouldn't cook your food. You know what I mean? Like, there are useful applications to this technology, and it depends on how well you do it. So just that alone, I was like, this is the perfect case for doing something in something like React Native or now Expo. Then she comes to me and says, well, what they want to do is they want to add a web version of this app, basically.
Yeah.
So now they're going to spin up a third team, Evan, to build a totally separate code base in Angular and C# to build that. And my head, as someone who's
that one in React Native, like React Native Web. Twitter's written in it.
That's exactly what I said, is that what you should do is you should have them build this in React Native Web. And then once you have the proof of concept and you have it working, you can be like, oh, by the way, if I click this button, here's the Android build and here's the iOS build.
Right, exactly.
You know? That's exactly what. Thank you, Evan, for saying that, because that's exactly what I told her that she should do. Is they should build it that way. But no, that's not what they're going to do. They're going to build a third code base in Angular and C#. And at this point, my head is about to explode. As someone that has maintained cross-platform code bases before, I know how difficult it is, and it's horrendous.
Yeah,
then it gets even better.
Okay.
Oh, God.
It gets better. They want to add a kiosk. Okay, the kiosk. It's something that is going to be running on some kind of tablet or something or other. And so they're talking about maintaining a fourth code base for this thing that will run the kiosk stuff. And I'm just like, you got to be kidding me.
Man.
Is this not the perfect case for using Expo?
Yeah, this is perfect, I think. And you also said something about it's not super compiler intensive, or like it doesn't require native. You can do a lot of very intensive things with React Native now, especially with the Hermes engine on Android. I don't know if you saw this app that The Verge had tweeted about 2 days ago. It lets you do this AR cut and paste. So you would point your camera at like a soda can, and then you point it and you would paste it. That was written with Expo. And that was not in the article at all. It was just, here is a awesome, sci-fi app, and it's the latest and greatest, coolest thing, and it's full, complete Expo code base. It uses 4 or 5 files to make the whole app run on the front end.
Oh, yeah, wow. I did see that, and that was amazing. But no, it's not that it couldn't be done. I made that comment because as far as apps go, this is not an app that needs to be close to the metal. It's essentially a glorified shopping cart to some extent. It
honestly needs to be closer to a PWA in a lot of ways. Because it needs to be like lightweight, it needs to be offline if you're going into a supermarket.
100%.
And a lot of that plays really heavily into React Native Web because it was built to be PWA, this great PWA that could be used offline and stuff.
So at the very least, they do have this somewhat separated in that there is a platform backend where all of the data is stored, right? So that's where all the API, all of the descriptions and images and all that stuff comes from.
Gosh, could you imagine if people wrote their backends differently for their front ends?
Oh, God.
But so, I mean, that exists. But here's the funny thing: you're gonna get a good facepalm out of this, right?
They use Access as a database.
So I don't even know what they're using. But the point is that there is a platform and an API that exists. So that logic and that stuff doesn't even have to be done in this app. So this app is basically a GUI that communicates with a backend. That's really all it is. So this is not something that you need to develop using native code. And
it should all be like fetch commands in JavaScript, because that plays 100%. Way better into using promises.
And they are running into so many issues where they're like, oh, it's like simple stuff in terms of laying out of text. Like, oh, we can't do this on Android. Oh, we can't do that on iOS.
I forget how good React Native is sometimes. Like, you have Flexbox, you got like state updates.
Right. And they don't have any of this. So, and there are all sorts just all sorts of nonsense with that. But the thing that's going to blow your mind is that, one of the benefits of using an app or building it in an app like this is that you can use it offline, right? Apps are usually inherently offline and can work, whether you've got internet or not. Well, all this app does is it communicates with the back end. So if you don't have internet, you can't use it because it can't connect to the platform, the back end. So it really is
a website.
Exactly. It's a glorified web app, That's all it is.
But they wrote it with Objective-C, right? Or what did they write it with?
Well, they're
something
planning.
Native, something not JavaScript.
Yeah, they're writing it with Swift on iOS and Kotlin on Android. But it's just, oh my God, when she comes home and talks to me about this, my brain wants to explode because this is a perfect case for using something like Expo.
Yeah. Oh man, yeah, it's hurting my head just thinking about it.
Yes.
I
It's
can't even
so
imagine
easy.
the budget they need for all these teams
Ah.
to manage this whole thing, and the infrastructure. It's just nuts.
It's monstrous. It's monstrous, like their budget, and they've got turnover. And what do you think, Michael?
Well, so what's going on in my head is, I mean, I remember PhoneGap and Cordova
Yeah,
and
I'm
these
sorry.
these very well-intentioned projects
they were bad.
that had this value premise, right? Of we're going to write the
Yeah.
code base once and
Mm.
package it up and ship it off to all these different platforms, and that to some extent that worked and that enabled this
A
sort
lot of apps are actually written with Cordova. I saw like on this
Sure.
stat.
So it works to some extent, but then, I mean, a lot of developers are walking around to this day with this sour taste in the back of our mouths where this utopian premise failed because the complexity of the cross-platform shipment just was too complex, and the ecosystems were moving too fast and too independently for it to really deliver. And so what's going on in my head is, okay, well, how is it different now? I mean, how is
Right.
Expo not prone to the same platform independence and platform complexities that PhoneGap was?
And I think that's what they're worried about, Michael. I think they had a bad experience with who knows what technology it was. It probably was PhoneGap or Cordova. But also, let's be honest,
Does that mean they're having great experiences with like Swift and Kotlin and they're just loving it?
Well, they're definitely not, right? Because but in any event, so you give me any technology and I can make you something horrible with it, right? So you see, it doesn't matter what it is.
I too have the skill, actually.
Right. Well, okay. You and I are going to have to compete because I bet I can out horrible you. But in any event,
it's on.
My point is, it could in part be the technologies weren't that mature back then, but it could also just be like the people who built it just didn't do a good job. I mean, that's a thing that happens. And I'm concerned that they are forever scared of using a technology like this because of that reason. So to Michael's point, Evan, tell us how Expo and React Native are different from using PhoneGap and Cordova, and why is it not prone to the same problems we have with those?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference, the most obvious one, is that Cordova and PhoneGap were web views, and you were running a web view and then exposing some native stuff to the web view. If you think about, I guess, conceptually, you want to get your location in a website, you would do like navigator dot something and you would get the location. And then if you wanted custom native functionality, they would have a web view and then they would add functionality like navigator dot, and then you could do purchases or something. And that just means that the view system was all rendered in as a web view, and you're just prone to a lot of these issues. Whereas React Native is just everything binds to a native element. So if you make a text element, you're creating a UI label. You can open it in Xcode and show the blowout view, and you can see all the different views. It's very, I think, reminiscent of just a really good framework, like a native framework. I think if you work on a large scale project, eventually you use some UI framework and then you build it out and build it out and build it. I would consider React Native to be very similar to that, where it's just, it's like this toolkit that you have. But at any point you can drop down to Xcode. You could write your own native code, add it. You're not limited to any, it's not this lock-in situation. You can mix React Native. In fact, that's one of the things that makes a lot of people use React Native over something like Flutter, is because you can just add it progressively to your existing native app.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's something that it also, if we have some kind of skill with JavaScript, let's be honest, learning React is not terrible. It's actually,
I would arguably say it's fun.
I would arguably say it's fun too. My point is, it's not, React is lightweight enough that it's not like you're not going to have to spend years learning it to get good at it. Yeah, I know. Right?
Just try it over the week. You can so Expo has this thing called Snack. You go snack.expo.io in the browser and start writing a React Native app. No commitment. You just write it right there in the browser. You could link it to the Expo client. So if you want to try it right now, it's extremely easy to do.
Yeah, it's like CodePen for native apps.
What's it called? Snack?
Yeah, snack.expo.io. And It's got like a little web view in there, and you can download the Expo client and start just testing native code, which you can't do with Xcode. It's a massive build or a massive download, and you got to build it onto your device, and you need like a cord, connect to your phone. There's just like a lot of there's like a lot of little things which could bog you down, but React Native has none of those.
Yeah, I had my app fully developed. I had Xcode running and everything, but then it asked for a cord, and I was just like, all right, that's it.
Yeah.
That's the last straw.
Writing this all in iOS, Android, web.
Yeah, but the point The point that I'm getting at here, though, is that getting up to speed with React isn't that bad. And then React Native is kind of using just say some components that someone else has written, right? So instead of using JSX and writing divs or whatever, you'll use text or you'll use whatever these kind of prefab components are.
I mean,
and
it's
you
still
can get it up.
JSX.
It's still JSX. But my point is,
Not
like,
React
this
DOM.
the switch from one to the other is not that big of a deal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if you're already doing it there, you just don't use div, you use this. You know what I mean? You don't use P,
Right.
you use text. You know, that
If
type
you're
of thing.
if you're in React world to begin with, or Vue world or whatever, you're used to using components. So now your components are just a little bit more granular, like a little bit.
Right.
They feel closer to the metal, but it's still just components, and you're used to using components that somebody else has made or named or whatever.
The fun thing is you make people like Evan write the glue that makes these components work on every platform. I mean, that's how it works, right?
Yeah, it's very, I mean, behind the scenes, it's just you use Vue, and then that switches between a web view or an Android view and an iOS view. And then the bundler, which is already set up, goes through and strips out the platforms that you're not using when you build it. So it's not super difficult to wrap your mind around how it works under the hood, especially if you kind of understand how a React component works. But if you're using something like Expo, and you can just open Snack, and then you can type like a div or a P. You can use all React DOM and slowly transition into React Native. There's the gradient to get onto it is much easier than ever before.
Now, I get that you've written glue that ends up mapping to native components, and that's what makes it very different from something like Cordova or PhoneGap, where everything was running in a web view. You are actually generating these actual native views or components on the respective device. The question I have, though, is what about the actual React code or the JavaScript? Is that running inside of like V8 engine or something on the phone, or how does that execute?
I thought you said you wanted to keep it basic.
I changed my mind. We're taking we're taking the steps down to hell. Let's go.
Yeah, this is so different from the pre-show. Okay. Well, so on Android, they're using a new JavaScript engine developed by Facebook called Hermes, which is a bytecode engine, I want to say. I haven't played with it too much, but it's super fast. And you run that on the device. So essentially, when you start up the app, the first line of code in let's say your iOS app, you're going to have that first initialize function in the app delegate. That's going to get a URL, which is the URL to where your JavaScript bundle is hosted, very similar to a website. And then it's going to download that JavaScript, and then it's going to pass it to a JavaScript engine, and then that JavaScript engine will, run the JavaScript, and then it will bind it to the native views, and you can use native APIs and stuff with it. But a kind of cut and dry without all the hot module reloading and all the extra stuff. It really is just downloading a bundle from the internet and parsing it in a JavaScript engine.
So that's really neat, and it handles multi-threading too, I would imagine, because you've got, there's a thing with JavaScript that all running on the main thread, but then can you have workers running or?
I think people have tried to do stuff with workers, but I don't, like Expo doesn't have any worker stuff. And usually when we have like a very baked out feature, it ends up in Expo. I mean, not like all the time, but all the native modules usually run on a different thread. So if I want to do something like image manipulation, I can run that in a separate thread, and it doesn't block my main JavaScript thread. So if I can keep touching buttons and having instant user feedback.
That was one of the problems with PhoneGap and Cordova is it just felt clunky and it didn't feel native. When you have a React Native app side by side with a PhoneGap or Cordova app, it feels much more responsive and native.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I didn't really think of that before.
I love the idea that we can use the superpowers that we have learned from doing web development and React and all that kind of stuff to build these iOS or Android apps, because those have historically been the purview of very kind of insular communities. I'm an Android developer, I'm an iOS developer, and they usually never stray outside of it. Like that's all that they do.
Yeah.
And one of the funny things that we were talking about is that if you are a native app developer, something that has just never occurred to you is the idea of the size of your executable, right? Like the idea because you don't like, you're just building this native thing. But if you're a web developer, you're very conscious of things like the JavaScript bundle size and the size of the resources that you're downloading and all this stuff. And it makes a big difference. So it's really interesting to see that kind of translating over into the native world where you Expo actually does like tree shaking and stuff?
Yeah, what we do, so there's kind of the two components, right? You've got the native code that gets converted to the binary for the app.
Mm-hmm.
You can think of that kind of like if you built Chrome just to run your one website. And then you've
God.
got like, yeah, I know. Well, that's how a native app works. And then you've got the bundle, which is that one website that it runs. And so we do like all tree shaking on that bundle. And then for the native part, what we do is we ship the native code in the NPM module. So you would yarn install Expo camera, and then you would run pod install again, or npx pod-install. And then that would link up the native code from that module to your iOS app. So you don't run into this area where you've got all of this code that you're not using because it's linked to the NPM module. So if you're going through and you're refining like, oh, I don't need this module, I can just pull in these few things, then it will also remove the native portion of that it's using. So in some ways, you are getting like a more efficient workflow for building a native bundle that's smaller.
And again, for a lot of apps, like the one that I was discussing that my wife works with, if you need a cross-platform code base, I mean, just the gains that you get by having a single code base and doing it in something like Expo are just astronomical. Like it's really hard to even quantify them, because you don't ever have one team being out of sync with the other. You don't ever have something being implemented differently on one platform than on the other. Like you just do it. And then the maintenance of that code in a single code base is a wonderful thing as well. I'm wondering, Evan, like, can you answer me truthfully? When would I not use Expo and instead actually build a native app?
Man, the reasons used to be don't use Expo because you need some native feature which isn't in the Expo SDK. But we've since changed that. So you can drop down. Essentially, it's create React app when you eject and you show your Webpack config. You can eject and it will show the iOS and Android project, and you can add native code, write custom native code. And like, because you can add native code, you can add any native thing that you want. So there really is no reason to not use React Native unless you just don't like React Native.
Well, what if I needed something super close to the metal, like I needed to make a game and the performance really mattered?
Yeah, you just write it as like a native module, but you could still have React Native in your app to render the UI parts of your game.
I guess the threshold is set by how much of your app needs to be that close to the metal. Because if you have some common UI bits that aren't memory intensive, that it would be nice to share cross-platform, then you build that bit in Expo, and whatever it is that needs to be extremely performance optimized, then you build it native. And at some point, that shared cross-platform bit might get thin enough that it's just not worth the overhead of Expo to have any of the app shared. Like, you might as well just build it all native. But I think that threshold is moving as the tech evolves. And especially with something like Hermes, because, like Andrew, you said if you've lived in the native world, then a foreign concept might be caring about the size of your bundles or something. And I think there is also sort of a flip corollary, which is if you've lived in the web world and not in the native world, you've never had to consider like the memory profile of the thing that you're running, because the browser takes care of it for you, and probably the device is just so overpowered compared to whatever it is that you need it to do. And like, maybe we play a little bit with understanding acceleration in graphics for animations and stuff, but that is an area where they're taking care of a lot with Hermes, with taking your frequently compiled stuff, and instead of doing it just in time, like they're rendering it to machine code and really optimizing for devices where the memory profile is crucial. And so I think that's a corollary. Like, if you've only ever developed websites, you've never really thought that close to the metal before, and maybe you don't even have to. Maybe the existence of Hermes just means that you skipped the stage in the technological evolution where you would have to care, and now we just automate all that away for you, which is pretty cool.
I'll tell you one way that I think apps are not that different from websites is that most of the apps that I've seen being developed, just like websites, are a struggle just to get it across the finish line, like just to get it shipped and out there, as most websites are too, right? In terms of just getting the thing done and out there. An argument that I would hear in the past about reasons why you might want to do it natively is, well, we really need the native look and feel.
You can capture that with React Native, especially with React Native Gesture Handler or Reanimated or Expo GL, which lets you run TensorFlow Lite or build video video games, and you have access to all this stuff now.
Well, I'm just saying that's an argument that I've heard, and
Yeah,
I'm sure that
yeah.
there are ways. Yeah, I'm sure there are ways to do it. But then also a lot of the apps that I see being developed, like for instance, the app that my wife's team is working on, there's not really a whole lot of actual native UI in there. It's actually UI that is specific to the company.
Oh, yeah, I hear so much of that where people are like, oh, but it won't be as perfect as it could be. And then they build the native app and they don't really write it as perfect as it could be either, because it's hard and it doesn't need to be.
Or the app is more like a glorified web view in that, like, I've looked at these apps, and a lot of the shopping type apps, they have pictures, and they don't even use like the native checkbox. They've got their own stylized checkbox. And I'm like, you're not even building a native UI. You're building your own branded custom UI.
Right.
And in that case,
payments.
Right. And in that case, something like Expo would be even better, because then it will automatically translate across platforms. You won't be recreating it on each one.
Yeah, definitely sharing components is something that like React Native has down pretty well.
Yeah.
And you can use things like Storybook too, like universally with React Native. Storybook,
right,
for the listeners who don't know, it lets you create this component library where you can go down and be like checkboxes, and then it will render like all the different checkboxes in different states, and you can just play with them all there, which is a really nice way to test if you're making a change. You don't have to go to like every screen individually and remember where all the checkboxes are.
Yeah, and it's
it makes
great
it
for
much nicer to develop components in isolation, but also for people that are building out screens, we're more junior developers. They can just copy paste the component code most of the time and work on the app too. So it's a great tool.
Yeah.
Well, so I have a rabbit hole that I'm interested in. It's kind of out of left field, but so I spend a lot more time in Vue.js than I do in React. And there is a section of documentation around Vue Native where you can use Expo for to build your Vue Native project. So I'm curious what, because we started the show and said, well, you can't use Expo without React Native, and I like cringed a little bit. I was like, I think you can, but I'm curious how that integration works and what your experience has been using Expo with other non-React frameworks like Vue Native.
So I haven't actually worked with Vue Native at all. I am very aware of the fact that people are using Expo to do this Vue Native, just because we'll get issues opened up on the dev tools. This breaks Vue Native, and then we'll have to like make some change. But I can't really speak too much to that. I haven't messed with it, but I think it's
I guess
like
not
less
your experience
kind of
necessarily, but people's experience that you've seen.
It seems like there's a lot of
speak for the people, Evan. You are speaking for the people.
Sorry.
Speak for the people.
Speak on behalf of every programmer out there that's
I am Evan. I speak for the people.
Well, my fellow Vue developers, what they do, oh man, I think like there's a lot of people doing it with hobby projects, and it works pretty well for those. But I think React Native really, or like Expo really shines when it comes down to those areas that are pretty baked out, like this auth thing that I just built, and things like that might be missing in Vue Native. And then when you hit those, it's like now you have to build it yourself, and it can get difficult to do if you don't understand like how everything works.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion for you, Michael, and this is an uninformed opinion in that I have not done it, but but just from looking at the technologies from the outside, I think that you would be better served doing one of two things. Either if you really want to do it in Vue, use native script, or just learn React. Like,
hasty.
React is not a terribly difficult thing to use. If you already know Vue, you can learn React. Like, it's really not that difficult. And in fact, we had Paulo on here a while ago to talk about some stuff. And you and I, Paulo said something about Vue being more opinionated than React. And both you and I were just like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, it's the other way around, And as I have delved more into React, like, I understand what Paulo was saying now. And so what Paulo was saying was, you don't have the concept of computed methods or data or any of this stuff. Like, it's all just components and render functions and props, and you can build whatever you want. I worry whenever I hear about someone building a project on the path less traveled, it almost always ends up being really painful.
Sure. And to clarify, like, I'm not afraid of React. I just specifically like working in Vue better, but it is also important to differentiate Vue from Vue Native, because Vue Native is just a wrapper around React Native, and it transpiles transpiles to Vue native, transpiles to React Native. And so there is a lot of compatibility there. It's not like the Vue web versus React web dichotomy. They do actually, they're quite compatible. So it makes sense
awesome.
that you can, it makes sense that you could use Expo to build your.
All right, Michael, here's a stick and a canteen of water. Good luck. Venture out on that road less traveled. Like, good luck. Get out there. Do your thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious because like a lot of stuff that I've messed around with Vue Native has been through Electron or through NodeWeb, and I really am interested in this graduating to a level of evolution where it's not just a web view anymore. Like that is very attractive,
right?
But perhaps without abandoning quite all of the tooling that I have come to be familiar with.
All right, so Michael brings up a really interesting point, Evan. So Evan, when can we get rid of Electron and we can just use Expo to develop a desktop app for Mac OS and iOS, and Windows and Linux?
Well,
do you have an announcement you would like to make today?
Yeah, I'd love to announce that I will not be sleeping for the next few weeks. In my React Day Berlin talk, I kind of showed off how you could use Electron with Expo Web, just because it's like a React website. So it's really just about configuring it properly. So that is possible. It's not super baked out, and Electron's pretty good. It's not too bad. I use VS Code every day, and I love it. And I also use Slack every day. I love it less, but not because of the performance or anything.
Right.
And I guess Electron was part of, I'm probably speaking way out of turn, but I think it was like part of GitHub. And so when it was acquired by Microsoft, they moved it into Microsoft, and they continue to develop it, but they also work on developing React Native Windows, and now there's with Catalyst where you can run iOS code on Mac OS. I think like we'll be seeing a lot more just people using like React Native iOS to build Mac OS apps. So it's not too far-fetched. I mean, we'll work towards it eventually, but it's not something I'm like super focused on right now. I think web is like a more interesting platform to target.
Well, I would agree with you for sure. But the only reason I mention it is that, it seems kind of arbitrary that we've got this layer of glue for native services and native components on iOS. Why don't we have, like, in theory, you could do the same thing for Mac OS, right?
Yeah, you can do it for any platform. I experimented with building React Native for CLIs. So you could say Vue, and then Vue would like render a box, and then you could click and drag that box around. It kind of like a blessed, but
oh my God.
Just like with React,
in Terminal?
In Terminal, it's awesome.
You are just evil. What are you doing?
I'm
That's
bogging
awesome.
down people's computers. Oh,
that's beautiful.
Just like with Mac OS, we just don't have enough time to work on it.
Right. But in theory, but it's interesting to me that is the focus, and I guess it makes sense, right? Because you have these websites and mobile devices came out, and everyone wants an app, so it makes sense that you would want to then target apps. I've just always have been surprised that another target, like a lot of effort has not been expended to making a Mac OS target or a Windows target, but I guess it's just so much work, and why replicate it?
It's a lot of work, and I think people have worked on it, but it requires some like group like Microsoft or Expo to come in and just kind of grind on it until like all of the little bits have been worked out and it's easy to use.
Actually, a couple of days ago, the React Native team at Microsoft announced that they're adding support for Mac OS 2.
Yeah, that's super exciting.
So it's coming.
That's very cool. And this makes me feel kind of bad though. Like, Evan, I saw that really awesome example you had where people could virtually cut and paste, take a picture of something and then paste it onto their desktop computer using their phone. Yeah. And I saw that demo. I'm like, oh, that's sweet. And then I'm thinking about, I can't wait until I show Evan how you can keep score on an Uno app, Like, I'm just like...
No, I love all apps equally.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? I'm just looking at it, I'm like, oh man, the scale of what I'm doing here is just really, it's kind of sad, really. Paul,
in a lot of ways, your Uno thing might be just as complex. I mean, the AR cut and paste, a lot of that happened in the back end using like TensorFlow Lite, which I guess could also have been run in the front end, but it just wasn't. So, I mean, it's just like some native functionality and then a server.
I just assumed it was magic. Personally, when I saw it,
yeah,
like some kind
and then
of
a
weird
lot of magic.
Yeah.
You can yarn install that if you use like Deno or something.
But Paulo, as someone who has used Expo in the past, you got Evan here, who's on the core team. You got anything you want to ask him about Expo?
Well, we've covered a lot of cool stuff. One thing I wanted to get a better idea of now that web is a target is there are times where you have to target iOS or Android during building your app. Do you have to do anything special to target web versus iOS versus Android when you're using certain features that aren't available in the platform that you're building your apps for?
Yeah, so the bundler looks for platform extensions. And if you do, for instance, file.ios.ts or file.android.ts,
Okay.
then it will resolve to those files. So you could have Android specific code in one or iOS, which, for instance, like a big feature that I added with Expo Web was the ability to use it very seamlessly with Next.js, because a lot of people wanted to server-side render their code. But Next.js isn't universal. It's just a web platform. So you need to kind of do a lot. Like you can share your components, you can share the screen, navigation, all the back, but you can't really share like the routing or a lot of like the SSR related things. And so I think a lot of that comes out when you just try to get really into the weeds of building a website that is very SSR focused. Although SPAs are also indexed by Google, so it's not like a deal breaker, I don't think.
Right. Yeah, I'm really curious about this routing that you're working on or has been recently released. You were mentioning earlier.
The routing.
You're able to use like a link
HTML
within
elements. Yeah, it's yarn add expo /HTML elements. It's also React Native HTML elements, and you can just import. I actually wrote a Babel plugin for it, which is super niche. I don't think people should really use it, but you could you could use the Babel plugin, and then if you import the package, you could just write lowercase p and lowercase a, and then the Babel plugin would convert it to the proper Expo HTML element, which would then be universal. Of course,
that's cool.
It is not the same as a p and an a element,
right,
because you have things like on layout, resize observer type things that React Native has, but it kind of is a similar syntax.
Oh, that's really
cool. But again, I recommend not using it.
I need to learn more about this stuff.
He just recommended not using it, though.
And it sounds really fun.
I mean, use it for fun. Yeah, it's like a fun thing. I could see someone making a website where you just drop in your HTML and it converts it to React Native code.
It was like when I tell my kids, don't touch it, it's going to burn you. And they're like, of course they touch it. And we're not going to feel bad for you when it blows up in your face, Paulo.
Hey,
I could actually legit see something like that being useful in a transitionary way.
Yeah.
Like I forget what it was with jQuery grading from jQuery 2 to jQuery 3, and the APIs weren't the same, but you could pop in this little polyfill thing, and while you were it helped you transition and upwrite your code from one API to the other. And I could kind of see if you are a web person and you're trying to convert a web thing into a React Native thing, then having this tool that makes it work right away, but can also maybe tell you where you're still using the old stuff, would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I kind of built it for that reason. So like if you were a React developer, React Native would be a lot less scary and you could just kind of ease your way into it. But then also certain parts of it are very important when you're building a universal app, like the anchor element, because it has proper types and does all this good switching out, and then the headers for SEO and stuff like that. The problem is it would require lots of documentation and lots of issue answering to be like, I know it's confusing. It doesn't work exactly the same. Not all features work the same across iOS, Android, and web. But so that's the only reason I would recommend just using it at your own precaution, I guess.
In other words, don't at him, Paulo, when something goes wrong.
I mean, you can at me. I'll just laugh, though.
You might ignore it. I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. So, Evan, I got to say, in preparing to talk to you about this, I did the little peeking around, and my kids were around when I was doing it. And I was trying to tell them that you do some really cool development stuff on Expo and React Native and everything. And they didn't care about any of that for some reason.
That's
I don't know.
The main thing I do.
Yeah, well, they don't care about that. But they saw that you're a master Lego builder, and they're like,
that's the other thing that I do.
They're like, whoa, like they think you're a god now. They saw some of the sculptures that you've done of various Marvel superheroes and DC superheroes and stuff like that. And they want your autograph. Is that a thing we could get? Could we make that happen?
I could only autograph it as open source God, but not as Lego God.
Ah, bummer.
Yeah.
Bummer.
But yeah, I used to do like a lot of the Lego stuff. I'd still do it now if I have more time. I've been meaning to build some new stuff lately. But yeah, it's a fun kind of hobby.
Well, you know what I told them, though? I said he still builds stuff, but he just uses more complicated blocks now, which is kind of true, right?
Yeah. Yeah, when I did Lego stuff, I only used 2 different types of Lego bricks, unless it was a face or something, because I thought it was easier to work within those boundaries. But yeah, now everything is way more complicated.
Well, and now when you're doing React Native and Expo development, now you use 3 different kinds of blocks, right? So you're ramping it up, right?
Yeah, now it's just 3 different types until someone's like, well, did you know you could actually change it all by affecting the bundler? It's like, why don't you change the runtime? And I'm like, oh.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm podcast. If you'd like to have every episode delivered to your favorite player, you can subscribe via RSS or find us on iTunes or Google Play. And if you like what we're doing, please leave us a review on iTunes. It's the best way to help others find the show. You can follow us on Twitter at devModeFM, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. For the devMode.fm podcast, I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Michael Rogg.
I'm Paulo Elias.
And thank you, Evan Bacon, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much again for having me. I guess you guys could follow me at Bacon Bricks on Twitter if you're interested in more of this stuff.
Yeah, and we will definitely put that and more stuff in the show notes. Funny. I just realized, Evan, that you in the beginning you were probably just like, "What the hell is he talking about?" I actually played the song "Footloose," but I don't think anyone else heard it.
I did.
When I
Was it
made
like a Kevin Bacon song? Is that
when I made the when I made the stupid Kevin Bacon joke, I was playing "Footloose" in the background.
gosh damn it.
As long as we can hear it on the episode, that'll be fine.
And it's so original, and I'm sure it's the first time you've ever heard it that I had to.
No one's gone to such lengths to play the Footloose song while also making the joke, so I appreciate that.
All right. Well, I'm going to edit it in just for that.